for our 6th annual March 4th, we're honored to host a group of contributing poets and writers to the newly published anthology, Ukweli, Searching for Healing Truth, edited by Herb Fraser and the late Horace Nugent. Author, editor, and journalist Herb Fraser is a special projects editor at the Charleston City paper and the former marketing director at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. He has edited and reported for 5 daily newspapers in the South, and he has been honored as the South Carolina Press Association Journalist of the Year. He is a former Michigan Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan, and he has led journalism workshops in Africa and South America for a federal agency in a Washington, D.C.-based journalism foundation. Mr. Fraser is also a member of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission. Susan Madison is a poet, essayist, and short story writer. She's the author of 2 chapter books, If I Can't Sing the Blues and Gullah Pass. She has also been published in local and national publications, and she has been both a guest instructor and featured poet for our Conroy Center. A native of Chicago, Miss Madison studied fiction and poetry at Columbia College of Liberal Arts. She now lives here on St. Helena Island. Yvette R. Murray has been published in Amherst Journal, the Pedigree Review, Catfish Stew, A Gathering Together, Column Response Journal, and Genesis Science Fiction magazines. She is a 2021 Best New Poet Selection, a 2020 Watering Hole Fellow, and a 2019 Pushcart Prize nominee. Presently, she is writing her first collection of poetry, more science fiction short stories, and a children's book series. Miss Murray was also a presenting poet at our last Pat Conroy Literary Festival.
Elizabeth Robin is a retired high school teacher and the author of the poetry collections Where Green Meets Blue, Silk Purses and Lemonade, and the forthcoming To My Dream Catcher. She's the 2021 winner of the South Carolina Writers Association Carrie McRae Higgins Fellowship, and she is also a frequent presenting poet and instructor for our Conroy Center. And she hosts a monthly open mic and partners with art groups to bring literary programs to Hilton and Island. Marjorie Wentworth is the New York Times bestselling co-author of Out of Our Wonder, Poems Celebrating Poets. She is also co-author of We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel with Herb Fraser and Bernard Powers. And Taking a Stand, The Evolution of Human Rights with Juan E. Mendez. She's also co-editor with Queen Boaz of Seeking Poetry and Prose, inspired by the art of Jonathan Green, and the author of the prize-winning children's stories of Shackles, as well as four collections of poetry. Wentworth served Poet Laureate of South Carolina from 2003 to 2020. She teaches courses in writing, social justice, and banned books at College Charleston. Jonathan Howe is the executive director of the nonprofit Pat Carter Literary Center, the former director of the University of South Carolina Press, and the co-editor of Princess Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, published by the University of Georgia Press and winner of 17 book awards. Please welcome the poets and writers of Ukweli.
Thank you so much. Because my teenagers are so incredibly famous, they very often forget to introduce themselves. So
We don't need to introduce ourselves.
let me point out that was Millie Bennett and Alicia Aurora, both from Beaufort High School, both Conroy student interns who have been with us throughout March 4th. And thank you all for being with us this afternoon as well. I see a lot of familiar faces out there in Frisell Community House and some new ones as well. How many of you are attending your first ever March 4th event? Oh, awesome. That's wonderful. And how many of you are here for second or third times? Anybody has been to all of the previous March 4th events? A few of us, yes. Cassandra King Conroy has. Yes, thank you. Well, down here at the Red Shoe end of the stage, yes, we're very fashionable. Thank you. One a little more than the other, I would say. If we're having a contest, you won, Susan. Just, yes. This is a real honor for me to get to do. This is a fantastic project, Ukweli, Searching for Healing Truth. And I just saw my copy for the first time today, which I think is true of a few of us. This is a phenomenal anthology, 45 writers in all, so if 7 seems like a lot, this is a fraction of those of us who participated in this project. And you may notice that we had 6 introductions, and those of you good at math may notice there are in fact 7 of us up here. We have a very special guest in the middle. This is Horace's widow, Miss Gussie, who's going to be representing chorus and leading some of in his absence, Horace got this conversation started, this beautiful, powerful, essential conversation. I wish he very, very much could be with us today, and he is certainly in his spirit, in the same way that Mr. Conroy is with us today as well. But I want to turn it over to Herb Frazier to give us the, for lack of a better term, origin story of the Ukulele Project, because this is a conversation that began a while ago in a place kind of like this with an actual audience, and now has transcended that into book form. Herb, would you tell us how the project began and where and why?
Thank you, Jonathan. But before I begin, I want to let everybody know that you ought to pick up today's copy of the Local Courier, which is a daily newspaper in Charleston. And there's a wonderful article about Ukweli written by Ricky Dennis here, in which he captures the essence of this project and really tells that origin story. Of course, you know, I am here and we all are here because of Horace Mungen's vision. We are here to discuss this book, but we can't do it without acknowledging Horace, a social justice literary activist. But first, I want to thank, and I've done this many times before, thank the incredible writers and poets who made this book possible. Some of the contributors, of course, are here on the stage, but we have some of the contributors also in the audience. We have Damon Fordham. This book comes from Horace's work to stage a 5-part poetry and lecture series at the Cloud Plantation, historic site in Charleston. He sought to pair poems, many of his poems, with essays written by others, then hold conversations on topics that are uncomfortable for some. That event began just before the pandemic, which interrupted it. Then the series resumed in the fall of 2020. I was one of the original presenters with Horace. The others were Karen Meadows, Damon Fordham, Hakeem Abdul Ali, and Yvette Murray. Osei Chandler was our moderator. When Horace originally approached McLeod with his idea, he wanted to call it Black History for White People Only. But after some thought, he settled on the title Ukweli, Searching for Healing Truth. Ukweli is the Swahili word for truth. In Ukweli, we cover the history of oppression and its connection to today's brutal policing tactics. We bring personal truths that speak to a white family's ties to that oppression. We remember the significant role Black women played before and after emancipation and during Reconstruction. We celebrate the Low Country, Gullah Geechee music traditions, and the moment of Jubilee at the dawn of freedom. But when freedom came, the violence of Jim Crow and lynching turned against the promise that all men are created equal. Once we fought for school desegregation, now we look inward to educate our own in our own way. We celebrate the Low Country, Black land, and the struggle to keep it. We ask the question, how do we as a people break the status quo and bind the emotional wounds left from slavery? We talk of joined community to uplift the spirit, mind, and body while renewing our African ties. We remind readers that Black people have a place in nature and a voice, and who should tell our stories. That's Ukweli. Horace told these stories and more during his long career as a poet and activist. Now, the behind-the-scenes story of how this came about begins with a telephone call Horace made to me around, I think, November or so. And he said, Middleton Place wanted to bring one of the Ukweli series to their site. And I said, wow, that's something. We started off at the Cloud, a former plantation site, and now another plantation site in the Charleston area wants a piece of Ukweli, and I think it was a series on women, if I'm not mistaken. That was yours. That was yours. So I said, Horace, there has to be a way to capture this lightning in a bottle. And I said, well, you know what? Why don't we do a book? You know? So, hence the book. But first we had to get to work. We got on the telephone and we started calling our friends and people we knew by reputation only. But soon the network of people grew. Soon we had a team of Ukweli essayists and poets. Once we had all of the poems and essays collected, we paired an essay with a poem with the desire to give the reader a double dose of truth from different literary perspectives. I could sense a level of frustration, Gussie, in Horace's voice that these stories that we were putting together for Ukweli were the kinds of experiences that white people misunderstand, overlooked, or just ignored altogether. That's why he wanted to call the poetry and lecture series at McLeod Black History for White People Only. Horace wanted to bring truth to a dialogue with white America to foster racial understanding and healing as a means to push against slavery's stubborn legacy. Now, I'd like to read just a little bit from Horace's essay that sort of speaks to that. I read better without my glasses. He wrote, "It was my contention that if only they knew the truth, enough of them would favor a greater degree of social justice reform. I believe that a sizable percentage of whites are confident in their individual abilities to understand they would still fare well in a more equitable society. Despite my awareness of past history, I held to the hope there were large enough pockets of honorable white people who, once confronted with the facts of systematic inequalities, would relinquish any resistance to leveling the playing field." That was Horace's belief. At first, when I heard that, I thought, this is kind of naive. He really believed that because he had spent decades writing and thinking and talking about it, you know? So, here we are at the venerable Penn Center. And if you go down that path right there, at the end of that path is the King College. That's the place where Dr. King, well, this is the place where Dr. King, doing training sessions for the civil rights movement, would come. Septima B. Clark was one of them. That cottage was built for him, but he never had a chance to use it. He was killed. The cottage was completed in 1967, but the following year, you know, he was killed in Memphis since 1968. Again, I take my glasses off so I can read this line right back. There's this huge portrait over the fireplace in the King College, and the quote there reads, "A man who won't die for something is not fit to live." Right? Think about that. And this is what Dr. King said about truth. He said, "The day we see the truth and cease to speak is the day we begin to die." So, let's not let that happen. Let's remember Horace Munching and the message of truth that he brought to us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Herb. It is a bold vision, an important vision that we honor here today. And I really want to hear Horace's poems in a voice that's as close to his as we can get. So if you would, President.
This is the poem is called America, but I'm only going to read one stanza because it's a very long poem and it'll take up a little more time. So here goes. Even after the monumental failure of Reconstruction and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the United States restored control of the South to white supremacists. The Negro was disenfranchised and betrayed by his country even after Negroes enlisted or were drafted in 2 world wars. To preserve the scarceness of those noble words in the hope of making them true for themselves, the oligarch ordered the ruling class to warn Negroes against moving too fast towards freedom, cautioning them of their aspiration for freedom. Even after 1919 Red Summer of lynching, they scold Negroes for wanting too much freedom. Even after Emmett Till was murdered, they bellow too much too soon about the dissent, and the ruling class white pass the edit down to the managing class whites to stifle all black attempt to bridge the gap. That was the first phase.
Thank you, Gussie, and thank you for being here with us today, too. When I got my copy of the book today, I mean, I may have noticed this when I saw the table of contents earlier, but it really hit home when I opened it up and saw that my essay is between 2 of Horace's poems, and the second of the 2 poems is about Pat Conroy, Horace's beautiful poem called Conrack. And my essay, which I'll not read from, but I do want to mention because I wrote about the thing that we're doing right now and why we're doing it. I wrote about Pat Conroy's last act as a teacher, which is his burial site on Penn Center property, about a mile from where we are, just down the road here, because this place, this building that we're in this Penn Center campus, was so important to Pat when he was the same age that my interns are right now. When he was a high school student, his teacher, Jean Norris, brought him out here for those very conversations that Herb mentioned with Dr. King, with Jesse Jackson, and Julian Bond, conversations that happened in this very room where we are today. And that opened Pat's mind and his imagination and his heart in ways that his teacher, Jean Norris, hoped would happen, with the optimistic hope from teacher to student that when Pat became an adult, he would impact the world in some way. He would bring positive change and honor the lessons that he learned here as a boy. Now, as a mentor to an amazing group of Beaufort High School students, I get to work with kids who are not waiting for adulthood or even waiting for adults. They're changing the world right now. And one of those students, Holland Perryman, who's not with us today, was motivated by her March 4th experiences to get on that path that she's still on today. So that transformation that happened for Pat here is still happening for people who can experience conversations like we have at March 4th, like Horace originated at McLeod as well. Those conversations, those moments are so important, and to honor that work with this book is really wonderful as well. I would be remiss if I did not mention that Mr. Conroy is in fact haunting us right now as well. But Pat was a student at Beaufort High School when the family came here in the 1960s. Pat had been going to private schools, so standardized testing was kind of new to him, and he had to take all these tests at Beaufort High. And he did really well in things like language arts, as you would assume for the writer Pat Conroy. But in mechanical aptitude, he was in the 3rd percentile, and that became a bit of a joke among the Conroy family, to the point where when Pat's sister Kathy Harvey quilt, a beautiful quilt, which we display at the Conroy Center, as a 70th birthday present for Pat. There's a little number 3 on it, and that's the thing that Pat saw first. Of all the many panels on the quilt, the number 3 jumped out, and there is a number 3 on the ceiling above Kathy right now. So that's Pat kind of checking in, seeing how things are going today, as he does from time to time. So, yes. Sorry, at-home audience, just trust me that it's there. Yes. But I want to talk about how all of you, magnificent poets and writers and teachers and activists in your way, came to be part of this conversation as well, because some of us on stage actually participated in the McLeod conversations, and others of us were invited as the book was coming together. And Yvette, I see you nodding your head, so I'm going to reverse my order and start at that end. Would you tell us how you came to be invited into the project? And then I'd love for you to read your work as well.
Well, Horace is my cousin, so he's been helping me on my literary journey, and to imagine how monumental this program started, he gave me a couple of sentences. He said, I want you to put together a lecture that looks at Black women writers across history. Okay, bye. And that was it. That was all the direction that he gave me. And doing the research for this, it's the most incredible thing, and it's in my essay, is the sheer number of women that there are. When I did my lecture, I gave everyone a list of just the names. I initially said I was going to just put together a list of the names and rattle the names off for 15 minutes. But I decided against that. I decided that, we need a little context, but just the sheer number of these women who actually published, not thought about it, not had journals that somebody found. They did it. And one of the things in my lecture was 1865. And I told everybody as I went through, because my essay goes through a timeline, and I told them to keep that year in their minds, because if you look at that year and look at when these women published, some of these women were born into slavery. If you could imagine just getting from being born into slavery and 10 years later writing a book when you weren't supposed to even be able to read, that is the enormity of what these women did, and it is absolutely amazing. I ask each of you, find some time to go down to the South Carolina room. These books may be difficult to find. Most of them are probably anthologized by now, because, we're talking about 1869, 1890, so they would be in the historical parts of the library, or anthologized, or in your historical rooms at your libraries. But that was so amazing to me as a Black woman writer that I have no excuses. Absolutely none. None whatsoever. And it was just amazing to learn from them. So I would like to ask you guys to choose. Would you like to hear a poem first or a piece of essay? Y'all pick. Go. All right. Poem wins. Absolutely. This poem is called Port City. Oh, my beautiful. You wear the evening hours so very well. It hugs all the curves and loves your cobblestone gams. Mesmerized I am by the mysteries of you. Closed red lips, secrets of indigo and mulatto that ghosts tell as we stroll by all manner of metropolis found. I am lost in the swirl of steel, blood, and glass. Phalanges folded intimately, your shadow leaping back into a as if you wish not to be seen, because you do keep secrets from me. Of coffin trees on avenues and still winds that blow, still. My rhythm is yours and yours alone, my love. I will not share with the moon, for I am jealous, though not a god at all, a simple man who desires the complicated love you have to give. Just a little bit of the essay. Black women writers as dark matter. Can you tell I like science fiction? Dark matter is more undefined by scientists than it is defined. It is a mysterious substance whose existence is observed only by its gravitational effect on planets, stars, and even entire galaxies. Simply put, dark matter holds our universe together. The same can be said of our black women. Our women have been the beating heart of every great movement in this country. We may not be the names remembered or even recognized. Nevertheless, we were there every step of the way, getting the difficult work done. Moving forward in our timeline, we arrived at one of the most romanticized eras, the Harlem Renaissance. Lasting roughly from 1917 to 1937, it was a period of intense social and cultural development that began in Harlem. Doesn't every writer want to be there? I mean, wouldn't you like to have been there with these people, been there? I mean, I know everything wasn't so great, but just maybe to be there for one day, just, one reading. But nevertheless, although it's centered there, the influence of these writers, poets, and activists had a global reach. The black women of the Harlem Renaissance were writers, poets, playwrights, essayists, literary critics, social critics, and editors. The sheer volume of their work is dizzying, and they often wrote in multiple genres. And if you want to hear more of that,
Thank you so much. Beautifully read, as always. Nice to have you back with us in the Conroy Center, too. Marjorie Wentworth, hi there. Hi, friend. Yes. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the pieces that you have in the collection, how they came to be in the collection, and I very much look forward to hearing you read as well.
Thank you.
You've got a poem in the book that is most famous for not being read originally.
Right, so maybe that seems appropriate. But of course, Herb and I had written a book together before, and I knew Horace, gosh, for a long time. And I just want to add, I'm so glad that his most recent book of poems is here, Horace Mundy, and I wrote the foreword for that. And I'm so grateful because I got to connect with him a lot in the last year. And I think last time I saw him, we were doing the audio recording, which is really exciting. So I guess the book's on a CD somewhere. Yeah. So I'm not sure. You'd have to ask him how he chose which poems were in here. But given the subject, I'm really grateful for the poems that are in here. One is a pantoum for you, kind of a pantoum with a repeating line that I wrote in the aftermath of the shooting of Mother Emanuel. And another one I wrote is based on a Roxane Gay editorial, kind of a found poem called So Out of Words. I like to write found poems. For those of you intimidated by poetry, you just take the words you like out of a text, and there's your poem. But I think I'll read the poem that Jonathan was referring to. So let me just find it here. Yeah, according to Jim Clyburn, it takes 2 minutes and 30 seconds to read this poem. This is One River, One Boat, and it's the poem that I wrote for Governor Nikki Haley's second inaugural, but I wasn't allowed to read it. And it's really a poem that's so much about how we look at history, particularly African American history. And it seems like it's sort of the message at the heart of this anthology. And there's an epigraph by Elizabeth Alexander, Barack Obama's first inaugural poet. I know there's something better down the road. Because our history is a knot we try to unravel while others try to tighten it, we tire easily and fray the cords that bind us. The cord is a slow-moving river spiraling across the land in a succession of S's splintering near the sea. Picture us all crowded onto a boat at the last bend in the river. Watch children stepping off the school bus, parents late for work, grandparents fishing for favorite memories, teachers tapping their desks with red pens, firemen suiting up to save us, nurses making rounds, baristas grinding coffee beans, dock workers unloading apartment-sized containers of computers and toys from factories across the sea. Every morning, a different veteran stands at the base of the bridge holding a cardboard sign with misspelled words and an empty cup. In fields of daybreak, rows of migrant farm workers standing on ladders break open iced peach blossoms, their breath rising and resting above the frozen fields like clouds. A John boat drifts down the river. Inside, a small boy lies on his back, hands laced behind his head. He watches stars fade from the sky in dreams. Consider the prophet John calling us from the edge of the wilderness to name the harm that has been done, to make it plain and enter the river and rise. It is not about asking for forgiveness. It is not about bowing our heads in shame, because it all begins and ends here, while workers unearth trenches at Gadsden's Wharf where 100,000 Africans were imprisoned within brick walls, awaiting auction, death, or worse. Where the dead were thrown into the water and the river clogged with corpses has kept centuries of silence. It is time to gather at the edge of the sea and toss reeds into this watery grave. And it is time to praise the judge who cleared George Stinney's name 70 years after the fact. We honor him and we pray. Here, where the Confederate flag flew beside the State House, haunted by our past, conflicted about the future, at the heart of it, we are at war with ourselves, huddled together on this boat, handed down to us, stuck at the last bend of a wide river, splintering near the sea.
Thank you, Marjorie. I'm so glad every time you get a chance to read that poem. It's 2 minutes and 30 seconds well spent, but it takes much longer than 2 minutes and 30 seconds to process and respond to. That's the very thing you were talking about earlier, Charlene. There's a poem that can and should be taught. There are so many avenues into that and so many reasons why it should be taught. So I'm glad it has yet another poem in this collection as well. Elizabeth Robin, my friend, 2 seats down from me here, sent me an email and said, Horace and Herb are going to ask you to do something. Do that thing. This is that thing. So I'm so glad that you sent the email, and gladder still that you're with us today to share your own work. So how did you? What email did you get? Who made you cross the threshold?
Horace. I met Herb for the first time. What was it? 2 weeks ago? Yeah, I didn't know Herb at all. But Horace, I met when I got my first book, and my very first book event. And I saw this man, this lovely lady, sitting at a table selling their books like hotcakes. And I not only didn't sell one, I don't think anyone even talked to me. So I went over, I was like, so school me. How do you do this? You know, this thing, because he obviously had many books. And we became friends. And Horace was actually the last program I did at Beaux Art before the COVID shutdown. It was the last one. Marjorie was the first poet there earlier the year before. So we see each other on and off. The last time I saw him was at McLeod when he mentioned he was doing that program there. And a friend of mine and I went to see that fabulous program. Horace asked me to write something, and he sent me the list of topics and said the essayists were already on it, and I should try and collaborate with them. One of the essayists I met, we walked the neighborhood in Columbia we wrote about. Aida Rogers, what an insanely smart, energetic, scholarly person she is. What a writer. She's a terrific writer. And the other essayist I have not met, we've spoken, he made sure to check my facts, since that's the first thing I asked him. Is I've written something. I need to make sure it's accurate. So the one I'm going to read, funny story, one of the last conversations I had with Horace is when he rejected my first poem. I'm like, I'm not sure I can do another one. And he's like, you can. Get on it. That's not what we wanted. Do better. I'm like, all right, I'll try. I was in a zone where I was playing with dialect, and I had written one, and he didn't like. I wrote the first poem, from the widow's point of view, because as a widow, that's a point of view I understand to some extent, although not these circumstances. And he's like, we don't want that point of view. So I pondered it, and here's what I did. Every fact in here is a matter of public record, and Ernest Wiggins checked my facts to make sure I wasn't messing up. But the persona I created that tells this story is completely fictional. What Mama says. Don't think I'm haunted, exactly. Not haunted, no. But I can't get one picture out of my mind. Truth means seeing clear. And hear what I see. A mother shot. Just watched her husband die. The bullet that wounded her killed the baby in her arms. Pieces of brains and blood staining her shoulder. She looking back. See her man and baby burn. Her house collapsing on them. Sky bright past midnight with their flames. And she turned, rushing her 3 bleeding children across the street, push them under bushes, where they crouch, untended by doctor or friend or food or drink for 3 days, while she wondered where her other 2 children be. Mama say the truth will set you free, but I was feeling trapped inside this truth. Amongst 13 men charged, my great-grandfather, big and bold on that list, indicted, tried, and acquitted on all charges, including killing the postmaster and his baby, the father and his baby. So I ain't feeling free, just full of questions. Did my mama know this story? My grandma? Of course they must have known, thinking Lake City history, ripe in atonement. The year my granddaughter born, we voted in 2011 to build a science museum in Ron McNair's name. In the year her mama graduated high school, whole town in 2003 placed a historical marker on the empty South Church Street lot to tell the story of Fraser and Julia Baker's lynching. And you know, since 1986, Ron McNair Boulevard crosses South Church Street, honoring him. Why? Atonement? Maybe. Late as 1955, that's the year I was born, Greater St. James AME Church, set on the site of that 1898 fire and lynching, burned. I hear because their preacher talking civil rights. Tain't a pretty history, but it are. In 1950, Ron McNair, born here, becomes valedictorian, MIT graduate, laser specialist, Renaissance man, Challenger astronaut, and the town's favorite black son. All them what saw the fire must have heard the shots. All them Christians. Where was they? We got 61 churches in Lake City. 61. Congregation maybe gone blind? Why didn't they petition for government pensions due, get a Christian charity? Ain't Christian, but Lake City folk did it in 1898 and before and after, and ain't nobody served justice. Remember the Maine, but not Fraser Baker, and the stain spreads, don't it? Mama say the truth will set you free, but if we can't see it, we won't never be free. I still can't get that picture out of my head, out of my dreams. Haunts as sure as that shooting happened. Does a sign, a museum, atone enough?
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. Yeah. I'm reminded of something. Is he still here? Hey, Drew, he is still here. I'm reminded of something that Drew and Janice said in their conversation up here just before this one, that we have to recognize first before reconciliation, before repair. And that's a poem very much about that. You have to see it first and foremost. Susan Madison was the last member of this panel to be invited, but Susan Madison shows up. She clocks in. You ever need anything, you call Susan. She will be there. And I'm glad to see you here, my friend, and I look forward to hearing you read as well. But tell us how you got invited, not to the panel, but into the book. How did that story begin for you?
Several years ago, I had the pleasure of reading the Forest Luncheon at Newport Arts Council, and I met him there. And I got an email from him late in the game asking me to be a part of it, and I was absolutely honored, and that's how I got involved. The point that I'm going to read is about hair. And I usually don't explain my poetry, but I'm going to explain why. I'm not going to explain the poem, I'm going to explain why I use this one to go in this book. There are things called stock stories, and stock stories are stories that people in power, usually it's the government, usually it's the power breakers, economic power breakers, create to do the things that they want to do, like slavery, so that the masses will accept it. And one of the stock stories that they told were that when they went to Africa to reap the benefit of those human assets, is that Africans were soulless savages swinging from trees. Well, one of the ideas that they also did, one of the stock stories that they used to disable us, my ancestors as people, is to discount who we were physically. And so our visage were discounted. Our hair was discounted, our bodies were discounted, our lips, our hips, everything. So as a writer, and Drew, thank you, as an activist, one of the things that I've done over the years is to try to give Black women, not that most of us need it, back their natural beauty, to let them know that it's okay, not okay that we are beautiful. Again, stories are told, sometimes very subtly. There's a passage in the King James Version of the Bible, I believe it's talking about Sheba, I am Black but beautiful. The original passage is, I am Black and beautiful. Okay? Big difference. And so here I read my story, and hopefully you'll understand why it fits in this book. Tribal dancing. For years, I raped you like you were a back alley whore, silenced by shame. I disallowed your character. Though you curled, I straightened you out by dousing you with lye, killing the very quality of you that made you you. But you refused to give up. You talked back with new growth that crouched low and crinkled close to the nap of your roots. With warrior tunes and a freedom ceremony, I cut off the damage of other folks' beliefs and watch you cut up. You, like a cooped-up child raised by old-timey grandparents, suddenly left out the house by death. You bent where and when and how you wanted to, stood like defiant tulips in garden patches, and floated in waves to meet my neck. You doubled over into crowded spaces and curled into yourself and giggled when you felt the wind. You flirted at the edge of my temples and caused my ancestral eyes to shine for mine. Arched my cheekbones and gave flair to my nose. You danced a freedom dance of puzzle patterns unique as thumbprints. You celebrated emancipation, tens of thousands strong, each an individual. You formed an army, full of glory, tribal dancing on my head. Amen. And I just want to add one last thing. A poor friend of mine asked, because I've written several points about here, is this the last one? I didn't answer her, but the last one will be when Black women stop being afraid of going swimming because it's going to mess up their hair.
Thank you, Susan. I always love listening to you read, too, because you have such magnificent voice, not just on the page, but you transcend the page so powerfully when you read aloud. I'm grateful for these opportunities we've had through the Conroy Center to host you in that way as well. We're going to have time for audience questions, so this is like your 5-minute warning game. But I want to ask a question of the folks up here, and this too is inspired by the last conversation on this stage. Drew and Janice mentioned something about not just why do you write, but who do you write for? And I think that's a question folks are going to have about this book. Who is this in fact for? And Herb, you may want to speak to that. But above and beyond that, I would love to know who you write your individual work for. What audience, if any, do you imagine when you are doing your work as poets and essayists and writers? Herb.
This is a great question. I think, of course, having heard about the vision, Horace Munton's vision, he wrote for white people. I think we also need to write for everyone, including Black people, because we know that this history is not in schools, and we need to let folks know their own history, a history that is now under great assault because of legislative attacks across the country on the so-called critical race theory curriculum. As we know, there is no such thing as critical race theory curriculum. That's another story. Maybe that'll be in Ukweli too. You know? So, as a journalist now, I got out of journalism for about a decade, and I was in PR. But now, as a journalist, I think I write, and Adrienne, my wife, she reminds me often that I'm channeling the ancestors. A lot of the stories that I write for this Charleston City paper, I feel them here. The subjects come from the memory, from the experiences of our ancestors, and many stories that are not well known or well understood. So maybe now I'm channeling not only our ancestors, but I'm channeling Horace, because much of what we do, what we have done moving forward, I think he still has a hand in directing us. And let me say this finally. He and I spent many hours reading these words on paper and on computer screens. This is the first time I've heard these words come from the authors themselves. I've heard Marjorie, One River, One Boat, many times before. But this is kind of surreal to sit here and hear the voices of the authors of these powerful poems. So it is raising this to another level for me. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I hope there are many more of these readings and these discussions too, because the opportunity to feature these writers, to put these faces in front of your faces and see the kinds of people who participated in this book and the kinds of writers that South Carolina even has to begin with is phenomenally important work. Yvette, can we return to our question though? Why do you write? Who do you write for? I think that's actually, who do you write for?
I would say that I write for anybody who will listen. And I say that because I like to infuse all of my work with truth, with real names, real places, real events, Googleable stuff, as I call it. And I say that I write for whoever will listen because I like to go into what I call sometimes hostile environments. You know, in the poetry circle, a lot of events take place like in bars and stuff. And I went in there. And I use this really, really big voice and, you know, the whole bar will be quiet for a little while. And then when I finish, okay, the roar starts back again, give me another drink. But I believe, and I've also gone, I'm on the board now at the Poetry Society of South Carolina. However, I did not start out being on the board. And the first time I went to an event at the Charleston Library Society, which I will say I am a native Charlestonian and never went in that building. Ever. It never looked like some place that I wanted to go. Never. And I used to walk to the Battery. Back in my day, that's what we do. And if you know anything about Charleston on King Street, I had to walk past it to get there and walk past. Never even considered it. But the first time that I went there for an event, the person that was there looked at me and was like, "Can I help you?" And I was like, "Yes, I'm here for the workshop." And I was like, "Oh, okay, this is right." But those environments, before they got to know me, they were a little hostile too. And I will go wherever and speak my truth. You know why? Because it cannot be unheard. Once you hear my words, once you hear those touch points in that poem, you cannot unhear it. No matter how angry it makes you, no matter how, whatever you feel about it, you can't unhear it. So, anybody that'll listen, here you go.
Thank you. Marjorie, you want to respond to that?
I don't know what to say after that. That was amazing. Who do I write for?
Who do you write for is our question. Yes.
Yeah, you know,
Person who writes the check.
yeah, we know about that. Yeah, there's those deadlines, right? But no, it really depends. You know, it's so interesting. I thought it was an interesting conversation in the last panel, and no one's ever asked me that before. And I guess it depends on what I'm writing. I feel, I think reading and getting to know Pat Conroy, who supported my poetry so much, made me feel that being in this place and not writing about the horrible history was sort of, he made me feel like it was okay to do it. I mean, it's not my story, and yet when I have an opportunity to write about it, I want to speak for the place. You know, when you're poet laureate, that's kind of your job. Not that you get paid anything for that. But the point is, I think it's the great unhealed wound in this country, and it sort of, like I say in my poem, it begins and ends here. So I feel that if people who wouldn't be paying much attention to this history hear it in something I write, then that's a good thing. But I really, thank Pat for that, because it was really, and Sue Monk Kidd also, and they're just, not that I can write like him, but just see writers coming out of this place who would address these issues and reach a lot of people seemed to me to be a very important thing to do. And so I've been sort of blessed with that opportunity. And I take it really seriously.
Thank you for addressing that. And thank you for the work that you do. Elizabeth Robert.
this time, all these turns to figure out an answer to this question, and I really don't have a good one, because I think I write for myself. And it goes back to, I was raised in a family where my parents used to say, ultimately, Robin, you have to look yourself in the eye. You have to live your life and look yourself in the eye in the mirror and know that you did what you should have done. And so when I have something in my head that I see or know, watch something, or whatever it might be, and I realize that I see it in a way that some people don't, I feel like I need to say something about it. And so, not being a confrontational person in person, I do it through poetry. But it's really, it started with a lot of grief that I had to get out, but, it's gone someplace else in the last few years as I've come more into myself.
Susan, who do you write for?
Let me say this. For the last 50 years, I have written, I still do, I write because I have to. I write because it comes from a higher source, and it flows through me. The words haunt me sometimes, they chase me, and they chide me. I also write for myself, because it's a healing process. But in healing myself, as I've gotten older, I've realized probably in the last 5 years that I am an activist and I own that. And so as I write, I heal myself and I heal others. And when I get that back, it's writers, of course, we all know, and if there's any visual artists in there, a lot of times when we create, we'll create something that we don't even see or hear, and other people will. So again, I write because I have to. I write for myself as a healing tool, and I write for whether it's Black women. When I wrote that point about hair, I wrote it because I had that moment that was so intense. I looked in the mirror, saw my beauty for the first time, and that was, for me, it was like throwing up. But it was also later for other Black women, and even for white women, that might look at our hair and say, oh, poor little, your hair doesn't look like ours. No, it doesn't. Thank God. So I think that I write for me first and for anyone who wants to hear. And we never know.
I was a publisher and a publicist when I met Pat Conroy, and he after a couple of years of him taking me under his wing, trying to be a mentor to me in the same way that Gene Norris and Bill Dufford and had been to mentors to Pat, he was always telling me that that really wasn't what I was supposed to be. I wasn't supposed to be in this crazy book business. I was meant to be a teacher and a writer, and I kept saying, no, Pat, this is the path I'm on. And all he had to do to prove himself right and me wrong was something so simple, every single one of us will do it. All he had to do was die, because his death opened the door that created those possibilities for me to become those things. And those are the two ways I would most readily identify myself now. That's the gift that Pat Conroy gave me. That's the gift that Buford and the Conroy Center and this experience continue to give me every day. And I write for the same reason that Pat told me he wrote, to answer a question that I have, in the hope that somewhere out there is somebody else who has that same question. And I can tell them, by virtue of what I've written, as Pat did for millions of people, you're not alone. Somebody else had that same set of experiences. Somebody else got through it in whatever way they did. And that's an act of activism. That's an act of love. That's an act of reaching out through the toolkit that we have, through words. And that's what you all do as well. I see that in your work, so beautifully presented in this collection. And I thank you for that work, and I thank you for your time on our stage here today. With that that said, I want to see if we have any questions from our audience. We've got a few minutes for those, and a hand went straight up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was speaking this morning with Joseph McGill, who was also one of the participants, about both this project and a number of things that are happening right now. And last week, or week before last, when we were at the Cloud, I was joking with her about how he was going to go to Tennessee and smuggle in copies of Mouse, right? Because of what's happening over there. And I mentioned to Joe something I want to share here with everybody today, is that because that, what I joke with him and what we're doing is, everybody's familiar with the concept of guerrilla warfare, which is unconventional warfare, right? Well, I said, what we're doing with this book is guerrilla teaching, in a sense, in that it's getting to the point where we have to go through unconventional methods to get this kind of message out to the audience. And I'm just happy that all of us are together working along those type of lines to get this out to people who need to hear it.
There you are. Michael came up with this brilliant ad that is in the Post and Courier. Read this. How does it go, Michael?
Buy this book before it's banned.
Yeah, buy this book before it's banned. So, write and call your legislator, particularly ones of the other party, you know what I'm talking about, and say this is a bad subversive piece of literature, and this book needs to be banned and taken out of everything.
Yes, Charlie.
I think from listening to all this great poetry, one of the things that is coming across to me is very often you and myself and other writers, we write about things that perplex us in some way. And it's the art of, or the craft of writing about it that maybe we don't get an answer, but it helps us work through that which is perplexing us. And I did have a conversation with Conroy a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about poetry. And one of the things that he said is, writing poetry or whatever can be a wonderful place of shelter, and that we can work through those moments that perplex us. So, great book, really wonderful, wonderful work. Thank you.
In the absence of any other questions, I'm going to end on great book, because I like that. That's a nice moment. So I want to thank you all for marching forth with us this afternoon and for the past 3 days. And we're all available